All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on when you're watching this. This is going to be chapter 3 here, or I'm sorry, chapter 2, how to safely develop ESP through the organism type, the believing community. This chapter is only about 2 or 3 pages, so to supplement some of the content and time that some of the other videos take up, or will take up, with chapter 3 here is especially long with over 20 pages. I'm going to jump over to some of these other documents and continue to reference them. And these are the same documents that were in chapter 1. I will eventually be switching these to some other documents as I try to support and cross-reference this content in the original document here, or we should say the lead document that these videos are driven off of. But for now, I would say as a word of advice, and just as, I wouldn't say to be cautious, but obviously you should be making these judgments for yourself, whatever you hear or see in these documents. It's been my understanding that this research has been around for 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 years, just referenced in various ways, whether you call it alchemical texts as they reference the transformation of the body, or alchemical texts as they reference the transformation of materials into other materials, sort of synthesis, to use another phrase. Other people might reference them with regards to religious texts, spiritual texts, philosophical texts. They all sort of coincide. So whatever door or avenue you choose to enter this stuff into, and I'm sure that everyone has entered into it one way or another, whether deliberately or accidentally, or in some cases having someone or something guide you in this direction. It's also known throughout the literature that everybody experiences it in some fashion or another, but because we don't have the education behind recognizing the patterns in what's occurring, we disregard it, and in some cases we've even trivialized it in ways where we just say something like, oh, the person's inspired, or the person has some inner light, or the inner voices and things like that. And just to continue on this little tangent here, I mean, it's no different than saying the Greek muses. That used to be a phrase or a saying. The muses were influenced by the muses. Albeit, though, that was usually in reference to someone being more sardonic and sarcastic or humorous, where they would, humor is often interesting because it's counterintuitive to the rational side of things and sort of exploits a ridiculousness about a contemporary pattern in society, or an operating pattern in some way or another. It exploits the sheer absurdity of something, although it has somehow become a mainstream or popular manifestation or pattern or something like that. In other cases, if you're a creative person or an artist, you have mechanisms or procedures or processes relative to you, relative to the moment, relative to whatever the task is at hand, that help gear you up and get you ready to perform whatever it is that you want to perform. A lot of those things, when we remove the semantics of it and just try to get the notion of what we're saying, just to understand the notion fundamentally, they all revolve around a lot of things related to cognitive ability, whether it's precognitive or cognitive ability. A sculptor has to know what they're going to sculpt before they start working on rock or clay. And then on the opposite end of that spectrum, where it's not a one-to-one thing, where you maybe have a team working on something, you have architects, engineers, and draftspeople all working to, say, create a building or a skyscraper. And because there are so many nuanced aspects of it, yeah, one person could do it all on their own if they had the time and were being paid and compensated well enough to just stay focused on that one task. But in that regard, it's easier to divide and conquer that project. So you have many people working on the floor plans, the elevation plans, the engineering, the electrical, down to the materials, where the materials are coming. If you have to make your own bricks, build your own house and all this other stuff, and keep it all on your head and know where you're going, eventually you're going to start documenting things, and by documenting things, you're creating a memory map. That's all that stuff really is. It's just a memory map. So if you're a note taker or a sketcher or someone who just likes to work more sporadically and just let work evolve based on your emotional state and the influences that are occurring around you, all of the stuff is related. It's all the same thing. It's just we've compartmentalized it and wrapped it up in a form of capitalism for the sake, for multiple reasons, but mostly for the sake to give everyone something to focus on unilaterally towards the same objective, and then in other cases to give some people a way to oversee the macrocosmic aspect of it all at once, and then come back around and work into the details and see what's right, what's wrong. It's all the same process. All right, so let me move on to chapter 2 here. How to safely develop ESP through an organism type, the believing community. So I made a couple mistakes with that interpretation whereby, and I could be wrong still now, but I initially presumed the quote-unquote believing community here to be a reference to religious people specifically. And while it may actually incorporate those people as well, because I do think prayer and meditation and those things do work, we just unfortunately have a different label for them. Some people call it prayer, when a lot of times it could be a group effort towards mind over matter, towards getting an objective to occur in the greater masses by sending energy out. Without getting too deep into the mechanical aspects of it or the technological aspects of it. I mean, a steeple and a church and a cross really look like an antenna to me. They look like an antenna. When you have a bunch of people praying in a building, and that building has been designed in a specific way with specific stones and specific materials, and people begin chanting, praying, singing, it is no different in my mind at this point than monks, Tibetan monks, working in those transcendental states and trying to connect with each other through song or lyric or even just physical contact. Now in chapter 1, we reference the bond that must be obtained to help people manifest their own abilities, to keep them from going off track, right? To keep the whatever awakening occurs or whatever feeling or emotion is achieved. It's in these documents, it's stated that it's better to work in a collective, and that some people who don't, and it's not that you can't do it on your own, it's just that some people won't know how to interpret what's happening, and that sort of creates distress, grief, and a bit of trauma for those people who are not familiar with what they're doing and what's occurring. So, but in this case, the believing community, I think, actually references those who believe in ESP to begin with. It is a seeing is believing, believing is seeing, feeling is believing. So I think that's what we're looking at here. But again, just to sort of pad that statement, it's applicable to both groups. One just has a different label for it, and the other has a different set of knowledge acquired through the market. Whether you read Jung or, for instance, Dr. Rhine, which is the Rhine Institute right here. Let me just read these couple of pages, and then I'll come back and do some commentary. So in a recent film interview, Dr. Rhine was asked to describe the conditions which seem to enhance ESP. He isolated basically two: high motivation on the part of the subject and a sympathetic testing environment. This comes very close to saying a believing community. Outside the laboratory, ESP seems to function best in an organism-type environment where the perspective capability satisfies a real need such as protection against threats of various kinds of other basic needs such as food or to maintain communal ties over vast distances. Lawrence Van Deer Post, with a reference at the bottom here, tells us that the American bushman regularly amazed his party by informing them that someone who the tribe knew was going to enter camp some days hence. though the distances involved were too great to have known such information by ordinary means. During one hunt, the party was met on its way back to a camp by a jubilant tribesman who said he came out to meet them because he had known along with the rest of the tribe that the hunt had been successful and that the great eland had been taken. A couple grammatical typos, so I'm pausing. I don't have this memorized, so I'm reading and also trying to formulate some thoughts at the same time to make commentary. Just to go back to the African Bushmen here in the X-Men stuff, there happened to actually be around the 60s, and I think it was the 70s, early 80s, there was a Bushman in the X-Men who allowed the X-Men to transport or open up a Stargate, basically, with his Bushman tool. I forget what they're called, actually. Sorry about that. So in parapsychological studies of the Australian Bushmen, similar capabilities were noted under similar conditions of great distance and a need for information exchange, which could not be met by normal modes of communication. These Bushmen were given European ESP tests and scored generally 2 to 4 times higher than the average European. Their means of contacting each other over moderate distances was apparently to build a fire which set up a thin column of smoke. This attracted the attention of another Bushman who, when he saw such a signal, was observed to squat and take thoughtful pose. He later would explain that somebody wanted to talk to him. Interviews with European bosses of the tribesmen revealed a remarkable ability of the Bushmen to know of family tragedy in faraway areas without radio. As pointed out previously, most spontaneous ESP-type events take place between members of a family or close friends, where is such information more likely to receive a sympathetic ear? Where would the motivation be higher to acquire threat information than in this smallest of believing communities? There is no doubt whether any reality significant parapsychological results will be obtained outside of such believing communities and realistic motivation. Such communities are springing up all over the U.S. today, and much work needs to be done with them. The two principal types of these communities are the occult and the charismatic. Of the two, the charismatic appear to be more of a permanent variety and more likely to tolerate close scrutiny. The encouragement given to clairvoyant and other perspective capabilities is intense. The communities are generally under 50 in number, and their personal bonds become very strong. The model of their organization and motivation is found within the New Testament in 1 Corinthians. Okay, so that's chapter 3. So while this is a short chapter, it has pretty big implications, I think, on the attitudes and perceptions. If you're familiar with anything that's going on in Australia, which was referenced in here, the Bushmen have been all but obliterated. And I think it's clear, to me at least, again, my mind is backed by a lot of previous reading as well as commercial reading from existing stuff in the market over the years. Some of you on the older side of the age spectrum here are familiar with Ingo Swann and Pat Price, as well as Jung and Aldous Huxley, Alan Watts, a lot of people who were bringing this stuff to the consciousness. And on the opposite end of that, people who work in law enforcement, when we say believing communities here, a lot of you are going to reference this as a cult. That's basically what they're talking about. There was the satanic panic, and I think a lot of this stuff has been attacked, essentially. The charismatic or the occult. Actually, they use the word occult here, and then the charismatic. We've heard that term, the charismatic leader, used as a way to reference cults often, and I think the fact that they really just rhetorically ask, where would the motivation be higher to acquire threat information than in the smallest of believing communities? I mean, right here, they've already established an enemy or a fear of someone. Now, this also, as I've referenced the Elena Freeland book, it references or loosely alludes to, which we'll learn later, alludes to the radio towers and versus the church and steeple effect, where we're told right here that European people, which are usually more bustling, less privacy, less time to think, less alone time, you're not in any really contemplative modalities ever, because you're constantly just moving back and forth trying to get through your tasks, despite having food on every corner or a roof over your head. It appears that the people who are, I think, less reliant or less dependent on other people seem to have better capabilities, as well as being less surrounded by technological advancement, which includes radio waves, EMF, VHF, sound, constant sounds, things like that. Like, for example, on this recording, you might hear a subway go by every 15 or 20 minutes, or a helicopter or something like that, which is very common around here. People yelling, screaming down in the street, things like that. Car horns, sirens. It's every 5 to 10 minutes around here, at least for me. Those of you that live in quiet communities, I'm sure you experience a serendipitous awareness as it relates to sound, at least just sound, in that you're so used to a certain tempo and a certain level of quality of life that anything that deviates from that will catch your attention, whereby in a city you're almost forced to turn everything off, which includes your ability to recognize ESP events, telekinesis, and things like that, because you don't want to be distracted. And then from a health aspect, or even a food consumption aspect, everybody's drinking coffee, or people are, going to happy hour, or people are, using drugs, whether it be cigarettes or marijuana. And every one of those things are an intoxicant in some way or another, even down to food. I mean, if you're starving and you eat food, you're gonna get a high from it, right? Coffee creates trails on your skin, often gives people lockjaw. It may give you focus. We know that in Africa and in Britain, when tea houses and coffee houses first became popular, those places were the place for philosophical discussion, because people were amped up on coffee. So their minds were being opened up both by interaction with one another through verbal communication, as well as surrounding each other with like minds who were doing the same thing. So it's a coffee house at that time was no different than the 50 people here living in a community, establishing personal bonds to become very strong. And we have variations of that now in society, but most of those groupings and those collectives, if you will, aren't wrapped around anything related to the individual or group development. They're more or less wrapped around fear or anger or discontent or dissonance. So just to circle back around to my comment originally at the beginning about believing community, church in a way, or a place to meditate, or a place to congregate and find peace with other people, which we've also referenced in here. These groups tend to accept everybody as they are, not to make judgments, not to come into something with presuppositions or assumptions that you neither thought of yourself, but instead were given to you by other people. To put it another way, someone told you who to hate. You didn't learn to hate anybody. You're told who to hate, and you're also consequently told who to like. It makes perfect sense for me when reading this document, and you can tell these people are smart because they have a keen sense of human nature. But it makes sense to me that they're going to talk and they're working with these types of groups of people, what we might call charismatic groups or cult groups, because they are purposefully isolating themselves from the broader mass, not hysteria, but the sort of programming that we're all exposed to. And people gravitate towards ideas and tropes and confirmation bias too easily to begin with. All of us do it. And that's also programming. I mean, if you have a child or had to raise a child in, let's take a dog or a puppy, for example, that maybe the child's 2 or 3. The child may be empathetic and may find the dog or the pet appealing visually. And there is some research to support connectivity to animals, and most of us that have pets know that they do. As the first chapter here said, the plants, men and women connect to their plants, and that proves the bond exists. The same thing happens with animals. That's all psychic connection. But a child who is not capable of recognizing those things, literally might hug the dog to death, right? If it's a puppy. The poor little thing wouldn't know that the dog is experiencing pain or discomfort without the dog expressing itself violently or in contesting it with a bite or a bark or a yelp. And then in a less destructive manner, the child may just be pulling on the ears and the dog and the tail abruptly, not recognizing, only because it's curious, right? Not because it neither recognizes a bond or recognizes the humanity, the consciousness of the dog in a small way. But that's going to happen, and I think we're all the same way whenever it comes to something new. Everything can't be a plaything, so to speak. Everything can't be something to scrutinize and harbor angst over or dissonance over. You can't feel so displaced by things that you neither created, nor invented, nor thought of. I think that's a point that needs to be said. I mean, you're flying an airplane, and yeah, you may have an uncomfortable flight, but man, you're flying in an airplane. I mean, you're up above, flying over clouds in the sky, in a piece of machinery that thousands and thousands of hours have been put into to make it as safe and comfortable as possible by other people who, in most cases, were far more dedicated to succeeding than stopping to complain about what someone else had done. They just kind of barreled over whatever mistakes existed and got through it to the next side, which was the solution, the final solution, which would be a functioning airplane. And when you're buried under all that angst and that presupposition and the inability to sort of rise above your own programming as well as the programming that other people have given you, you're not going to be able to access these abilities, I don't think. You're also not going to be able to bond with people well. You could bond through anger and hate, and I'm sure that is a variation of this. I actually don't know if that has been referenced through any of the material. I haven't seen that referenced. Most of the bonding or conjoining has been through like-minded. So I guess if we were to put anger and hate or sarcasm, those are definitely ways to express energy, mental cognition, so to speak. And I'm sure that we know that groups exist like that. I mean, going back to comedy, as I brought up before, a lot of the comedy that for, I think, of almost 10 years, I mean, I couldn't watch a lot of things just because it was really self-deprecating. It was just literally the comedian making fun of themselves and really just I mean, we had to watch a psychoanalytic. We had to watch these people instead of going to a therapist or someone just learning to talk with other people and take input. They basically, go on stage and expound their hate and inverse it on themselves. And I never found that really valuable. For me personally, confessing your sins and confessing your discontent works much better with people you trust and also people who you respect to validate, qualify, rebuke, or debate you. And I don't see a lot of people being able to work on those levels where they're just like, hey, I love you, we're great, we get along. I understand 50% of your brain is not like 50% of my brain, and it's going to bring up some really interesting things to discuss. I mean, that's all there is to it. Everyone, I think most people embrace their individualism. So the last thing we should be doing is using our individualism as a way to attack other people, or because of maybe some sort of trauma, you're incapable of connecting with anybody without these mechanisms of angst coming up. And just to soften that comment a little bit, it's just everyone learning how to communicate better, and most of us just have what we have and what we've learned. There hasn't been anybody pushing us. As I mentioned in chapter 1, there's those three ways to move forward, which is someone else putting you in creating the catalyst for you to force you to change and move forward. There is the self-discipline version, and then there's just a random event that occurs. And we all fluctuate through all three of those because we all interact with many people throughout our day, whether you have a job or you have your own business or you're simply raising a family, right? Kids are going to challenge you just as much too. All of those things exist without the need to force it onto other people, like it's going to exist. Like, just accept that other people are going to have different ideas. I think, not to harp on this any, but I'll keep this commentary short, but I was a bartender for a while, and being young, you have certain stories. Most aren't really that good, but you recognize early on in the bartending arena, especially if you're if you're in a bar where it's not full of loud music constantly and you actually have to engage with your clients and your customers, you learn real quick how really significant every individual person is at that bar and how just unique all of those opinions are. And then that's an interesting place because a lot of people will talk across the bar, talk across to each other, and just express their ideas and either laugh or chuckle, or most violence that does occur isn't really related to those conversations unless someone's had some real stringent programming or someone's deliberately trying to harass someone else. And other than that, though, I was really struck by, it's still one of the things I remember the most, many of the stories that people told me or the things that occurred there, that when you're kind to other people, how kind they will be. And conversely, if you're rude to someone, you're gonna get it back, and you have to really just find that balance in between. I mean, the balance for me really came from a profiteering standpoint, because I was like, I'm not going to make money unless I can cater to people's demands. That's really what it came down to. And then after that, I was like, I wasn't trying to be greedy. The only thing I wanted to do was make money for the effort that I put in. And after I got over that, you just kind of go into work and you're happy and you're content, and you're really just paying attention to the service you provide. And then you move beyond that and you're like, man, I'm able to work, get drinks done, clean up stuff, get food out, and then just listen to stories at the same time and really absorb what people are trying to tell me and all these various ideas and notions about things. And you learn very quickly that your bias and your presumptions at best are just really low-level forms of defense to protect you from predators, right? People who are going to take advantage of your ignorance. But if you go into every situation fearful of the predator, you're not going to learn much. You're only going in with what you had, and you're coming out with what you had. At the same time, referencing the 3 ways to move forward that I mentioned in chapter 1, you got to take a little bit of abuse to recognize how far abuse might go. And you have to know the skills of predators, because the predators scale up as well. They go through the same sort of trial and error that we do. And I'm not using good or evil in this context specifically. I'm just using a more natural approach to harm or malcontent through a predator, because an officer who has to take down someone with a bullet could be considered a predator, but that's why they have laws in place to identify what actually happened. On the surface level, though, the officer, a lot of them are trained to just be able to fire, not hesitate, and then move forward. And they have to be, because they might be in a life-threatening situation themselves. It's then up to their laws and their processes, and our laws and our processes, to figure out what the intent of that was. So that could be either predatory behavior or completely offensive and defensive behavior. So just keep all that stuff in mind as we're going through these documents. You can't have any hang-ups about it. You can have comments, you can have reactions, but if you're sort of just itching to get a word in, or you don't let people finish what they're saying or actually listen to what they're saying with the words they're saying, you're never going to understand. And just to close this on a final thought, this chapter on a final thought here, I mentioned Alan Watts, and he has a great book, which I'm just going to paraphrase the description and analogy he used to try to explain to us how labels work for us and against us. And some of you might call them spells and spelling, and I agree with that interpretation as well. But he uses the word desk. Now, like what I'm using right here to sit on and what you might be sitting at now. The word desk does not designate any specific type of desk. It's just a loose description to help people identify something in an environment. Later on, you might have a wooden desk or a glass desk, or you add these modifiers to it. But overall, that word loosely is just a very broad way of describing a four-legged item with a flat surface on it somewhere in the room. Maybe has drawers, maybe it doesn't have drawers. Maybe it has a lamp on it, maybe it doesn't have a lamp on it. If you've ever had to go help someone out at their home, or someone goes away on vacation and you've never really been there before, or you have been there but you haven't been in the room they want you to go get their keys from, or whatever the thing is, someone will say, go to the armoire, and you'll look at the armoire and you're like, I don't think that's an armoire, I think that's a hutch. And it takes you 10 minutes to sort through what they're actually talking about. And we have to recognize that's the same exact thing that happens when we say prayer or meditation or ESP. It's just a context. It's a very, if I say desk, I'm not saying kitchen counter. That's all that means. It's just a loose representation of it. And just to add to that, the word design is actually Latin for designate. It doesn't have anything to do with ornamental value, embellishment, or anything like that. So once you put that definition in your head, what design means, you start to look for designs. That's what you're looking at. What object in this room designates what I think is a desk and what this other person thinks is a desk? All right, let me just jump over to this document on the side here. So this is the testing for cryptological aspects of ESP. And we have A, B, C. I would download this offline and check this out. Another thing to note as you're reading these documents, you're going to see that there's multiple types of notes here. There's the notes from the originating creators, which I think is right here. These are the original writers. And then there'll be the notes from the declassifiers, the people who were tasked with declassifying the material and then adding classification boxes, right? So this one doesn't have a lot, but it has just enough to make you wonder why, right? So this one says Miss So-and-so. So this will have the person's name, why she's given security or secrecy. No one knows. But apparently she scored ridiculously high. And possibly for fear of her life, maybe. Like I said, there are groups of people, or I didn't say it, but I referenced it. It's clear to me that there are groups of people who are actively working against allowing people to surface their abilities. And on worse, I think there are predators out there who seek to manipulate it. They're aware of how it works. They know how to harness it. They know how to force someone to work against their own instincts, however, still surfacing those abilities in a way that makes it beneficial to the predator. And then worse than that, I think there's people who just shut it down. I think a lot of the technology we see is not necessarily for our benefit. And I'm sure those of you that are even this far, whether you've went through video 1, 2, or 3, chapter introduction, chapter 1, chapter 2, this one being chapter 2, then you recognize there's an issue with some of the things that we use. And it's a lot of that stuff that's circulating right now is backed by peer-reviewed science. And speaking of science, let's just close off with some other little tidbits of information that some of you may or may not know. The Dr. Rhine here. So this is the Rhine Institute. This is what has become the Rhine Institute. Another program you may hear me reference in these documents or read yourself is SRI. That's the Stanford Research Institute. Before the NSA, the CIA, the DOD, and all these people were involved in research, we know that hospitals around New York, California, research institutes were actually already, probably since the early 1800s, due to occult literature, alchemical literature, Masonic literature, religious literature, including Christianity, Judaism, Hindi, Sanskrit. All those documents contain the same stuff. Egyptian research, organizations like Sinai, Maimonides, what else? John Hopkins. They're all referenced in a lot of these materials. And we're talking from the 60s and 70s. So all of them had entered into their own types of research, although we later learned that, including the Nazis, right? That's people love to use the Nazis as the epitome of occult horrors, but once you dig deep into the literature, you would recognize, one, that the United States wouldn't have brought those people over unless they found value in it, and two, it's not the Nazis. This is ancient information about awakening everybody. So those institutions like Maimonides and Sinai and Beth Israel and all those, they all have in their records various data sets related to ESP, and I'm sure that they've performed just as many experiments that we would all hate and all frown upon as the NSA or the CIA. And those very institutions now are commercial institutions which people go to give their blood, to get EEGs, to get sonograms, and this isn't I'm not trying to incite fear or anything like that, but we have to recognize that there are still people in those organizations that are familiar with this stuff and may have the ability to recognize these abilities in other people. So it's definitely important knowing who you're talking to, even though you want to trust everybody, and I just sort of explained that trust and empathy and all that is very important when you're discussing this stuff and trying to awaken yourself or other people. It's unfortunate that it seems to me, at least in my interpretation of this stuff, that there are more people working against it. And I think that's strongly a religious contingent, because it's usually those people, unfortunately, who think they have the rights to keep people from doing things, or on a less spiritual level and more of a moral and ethical law level, much like this document has claimed and states, they think that if you can do this, it's a type of mental illness or something like that. And I think we have to be very careful with how these things are communicated going forward. I know that there are many people on YouTube talking about it, and some of the actual researchers like Russell Targ and Edwin Mays have all recently been giving videos on a podcast, as well as some other people heavily involved with parapsychology. I forget her name. She's quite well known in the circles. Some of you may know her name. I forget. I think it's Deborah something. I forgot her name. Apologies to Deborah if that's her first name. They've been given a pass, right? They can study it. I don't know if they practice it. I think some of them have and have given reference to it. But I don't think it's fair to say that anybody should be able to judge anybody else. If you believe in God, then these things exist inside of that philosophy, because they wouldn't exist without God. And if you don't believe in God, you have to believe in something greater than yourself in order to manifest any of this stuff, because the ego isn't going to get you there. So All right, I'm closing this up. Chapter 2 is finished, how to safely develop ESP through the organism type. The next video will be on Chapter 3. That's a very long one. I don't know if I'm going to read for 20 pages. I think some of you would fall asleep. I may just do it just to have it recorded, and because of how much of the literature I can supplement with some social commentary and correlate back to some other things, it may be worth it. It doesn't matter. It's just video. You can always scrub through it and or delete it or skip it. But Chapter 3 will be ESP, a threat to ComSec, a survey of open literature. Well, there you go. So we're going to probably be looking at what they've already referenced and look at what some other countries and organizations were already doing, looking at test results and things like that. So I may not have to read too much.